My name is Dr. Jacob Roram. I am a Public Programs Associate here at the Minnesota History Center, and I'm so glad to see so many wonderful faces here on a Saturday morning. And it was also nice to see a little bit of snow this morning. I mean, it's just a little bit, but I know this winter doesn't seem to want to show up. And I think some people are glad about that, and I know a lot of people are sad. So we will wait for it with bated breath. A couple things I want to let you know about is just upcoming events. Of course, we've got more history forums on the way. We've also got a great program next week. It's the last of our North Star Voices series. It's going to be about the history of streetcars in Minnesota and the ways that they've really shaped our landscapes and our cities and towns across Minnesota. And I think people are familiar that there were streetcars here in the Twin Cities, but there were streetcars all over the state in all sorts of different. So we have Aaron Isaacs from the Minnesota Streetcar Museum who's going to come and talk about that history. It should be really good. That's free. It's at 2 p.m. next Saturday. And then we've got a last of a comic series we've been doing of highlighting local comic artists. That's going to be on January 21st. That's a Sunday with local writer James Curry and local artist Tom Nguyen. They wrote a comic book about Curry's family, who was one of the first black families to settle in Hastings, Minnesota. And they helped found the first African-American church there that was burned down in an act of racial violence in 1907. So they're trying to tell this difficult history in the form of comic books. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation about how to bring that history to new audiences and new generations through this form. And it's part of our series of celebrating local comic artists because, of course, we have the life and art of Charles Schulz here at the museum. And speaking of that, we have our next history forum is about Charles Schulz. It's with Blake Scott Ball in February about the politics of peanuts. A lot of times people think that peanuts is fairly apolitical, and this historian is going to sort of unveil that that's not quite true, that Charles Schulz was very much engaged in large topics of conversation throughout his career. So it should be a really good one. And today's talk is also connected to one of our exhibits in a way. I didn't even plan that. It just happened. If you haven't seen our great new exhibit, Reframing Our Stories, it's a photography exhibit that looks at a box of photography, well, it comes from a box of photographs, excuse me, that were simply labeled Indians. That was from the Tribune and Minneapolis Star, or now the Star Tribune, archives. And so our team here, especially our Native Americans Initiatives team, has done great work to try to find the backstories and identify the people in these stories, give it some context, historical background, and it's a really terrific photography exhibit. And there's a couple photos in there that specifically talk about housing and the ways that American Indians here have fought for housing equity and fairness, but also the ways that the non-Native community has struggled to understand when Native families show up in places like suburbs and trying to figure out, oh, that seems odd to us. But of course, our speaker today is going to show us the long history of suburban natives, and it should be really good. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Kasey Keeler is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She has a joint appointment in the Department of Civil Society and Community Studies and the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. And we're going to be getting a glimpse into her first book, American Indians and the American Dream, Policies, Place, and Property in Minnesota. It really is a great opportunity for us to look at great historical scholarship that's about our Twin Cities community and the long history of federal housing policy and federal Indian policy that has made homeownership a very different experience for a lot of Native families and Native communities. She is also someone who is local. She was raised in Coon Rapids, so it's nice to bring someone who's from here back to the Historical Society to talk about her wonderful work. So without further ado, please a round of applause for our wonderful speaker, Dr. Kasey Keeler.
Good morning, and thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. To begin, I would like to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for inviting me to speak today as part of their ongoing dialogue series, the History Forum. I am delighted to contribute to this rich programming and share my research with all of you today, including the work of my first book, American Indians and the American Dream. So today I will share how I came to this project along with an overview of the larger book, including the major interventions and the key themes moving in chronological order. I will provide an overview of the book and an overview of federal Indian policy and federal housing policy that has guided the book. And I welcome questions and some conversation at the end as well. So American Indians and the American Dream is a historical monograph about American Indian peoples and places, specifically the suburban Twin Cities that surround us today, about access to the suburbs, and about access to home ownership for American Indian people during the 19th, 20th, and now into the 21st centuries. While the entirety of the book spans the mid-19th century through the 2010s, I also use my family story as a way to narrate the book, particularly through the introduction. In examining my own family's history and relationship with the suburbs and American Indian homeownership, I think through my childhood and my youth and young adulthood working with Native families in the Twin Cities. Through these time frames, I continuously return to questions about why it felt like American Indian people did not belong in suburbs, or perhaps they were not necessarily welcomed in suburbs. For me, first as a homeowner in the Twin Cities here, and now as a homeowner in Madison, Wisconsin, this is a story that continues to unfold, a story that began in Oklahoma, where I was born. So my family came to Minnesota in the mid-1980s. First, we were renters, and eventually we were able to purchase a home. My parents were able to purchase a home in suburban Coon Rapids, then still a very much developing and growing suburb just 20 miles north of Minneapolis, or 20 minutes north of Minneapolis. As a youth growing up, I participated in the Indian education program in the Anoka-Hennepin School District, and this program forced me to reconcile my own identity. However, growing up, it was nothing that I seriously reflected on in terms of what did it mean to be an American Indian person living in a suburb. Although I always knew I was Native, I never really thought critically about what it meant to live away from my tribal communities and away from my families, my extended family, I should say. Living in Minnesota growing up, I lived just with my nuclear family. We didn't have any other family in the area. So my mom was the first and the only person in her family to leave her reservation community in California. And since then, she has also returned to California. So I grew up here in the Twin Cities. I am an enrolled tribal citizen of the Tuolumne Band of Me-Wuk, which is in California. So I grew up as a Native person, a Native youth, and now a Native woman in the Twin Cities, but I am not Dakota, and I am not Ojibwe, so communities that I am very familiar with, having grown up here, but this is not my homeland. So I think this also added an extra layer of complexity to my own identity of what did it mean to be a suburban Indian growing up in somebody else's homeland. So these are reflections that I came to after completing my undergraduate degree in Wisconsin, coming back to Minnesota to work. I also worked at the Anoka-Hennepin School District in their Indian education program after completing college, and I worked with Native youths and their families, and I saw them too grappling with these issues about identity and place and belonging. So it was during this time frame, after college, having my first real work experience with Native youth and their families, that I started thinking about larger questions of identity and place for Native people, and that led me to graduate school here at the University of Minnesota. So the book has several major themes that carry throughout. A few of the guiding questions that I attempt to tackle in the book and also leave open for readers to interpret and to pursue on their own are: what does it mean And why is there such a disconnect between American Indian people and American Indian identity and belonging and a suburban residential location? So I don't think these are concepts that have necessarily been put together previously and that folks haven't really critically reflected on or thought deeply about, even though once you start hearing about it that, oh yes, it does make sense. Obviously, American Indian people live in suburbs. I also think about the question of how have American Indians experienced suburbanization, past and present, and also home ownership. So what does that look like in suburban areas across the Twin Cities? I think about the way that federal Indian policy and federal housing policy have shaped American Indian people's access to suburbs and home ownership as well. And a final question that guides my research in the book is why has there been such a failure to recognize contemporary suburbs as historically Indian places? And by that, I mean places that Native people have always lived. And I think a good example and a reminder of that across the Twin Cities in particular are looking at the names of the suburbs that dot the Twin Cities, that dot the larger landscape of present-day Minnesota, places like Shakopee, Chaska, Anoka, right? And Minnetonka, Wayzata. And we recognize that these names come from indigenous languages, primarily Dakota, and that Native people have always lived in these geographies. So the book moves in largely chronological order. And I take a historical approach to answer these questions. So to think through American Indians and suburbs, I look at what I see as 5 key moments from the mid-19th century to present day, and intersections at these key moments of federal Indian policy and federal housing policy. And once I started doing this research, it really was remarkable at how closely there were intersections in time between federal Indian policy and federal housing policy. Oftentimes legislation was passed in both of these areas within mere days of one another. So the chapters or the timeframes that I take on in the book begin in chapter 1 with a look at the mid-19th century here in Minnesota. So I examined the ways that the Homestead Act, which was signed into law on May 20th, 1862, opened up millions of acres of land just weeks before the US-Dakota War unraveled in late August and September 1862. So this chapter really digs into Indigenous dispossession and the rapid arrival of non-Native settlers across the same regions. Here I work to highlight the way Native people, Dakota people in particular, were forced out of their homelands to make way for non-Native settlers, a process that is inherently violent. In chapter 2, I move to look at 1934, at the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, which was created by the passage of the National Housing Act on June 27th, and the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, also known as the IRA. In this chapter, I call attention to the ways American Indian people saw a return of tribal autonomy following the disastrous policy of allotment, and how, despite achieving US citizenship, many American Indian people were still excluded from housing policy and programs designed to make home ownership for all Americans attainable and accessible. Moving forward, chapter 3 looks at the intersection of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as the GI Bill, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs American Indian Relocation Program that rapidly unfolded following World War II. These two programs, the GI Bill and relocation, really reveal the way that housing and home ownership was always envisioned as separate and distinct for American Indian people and other white Americans. The GI Bill is well recognized for its home loan benefit, allowing World War II veterans access to developing suburbs. But for American Indian veterans, this opportunity was largely closed as they were directed to pursue relocation policy, a program that provided temporary federal assistance for American Indian people to move to designated urban areas, almost always into short-term housing. Moving on to the chapter 4, I examine the creation of HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, as a cabinet-level agency in 1965, as a component of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty, and the development and creation of the Little Earth Housing Complex in Minneapolis in 1973. In this chapter, I work to highlight the tensions that exist around federal funding for housing programs and American Indian housing programs, particularly off-reservation and in urban areas. Here, I draw attention to the limits of federal funding for American Indian housing and really what is the failure of HUD through levels of bureaucracy to fund Indian housing off-reservation, a promise that I argue is outlined in numerous treaties with tribal nations. Finally, in chapter 5, I move to the early 2000s to think through more contemporary American Indian homeownership and suburbanization. In particular, I look at the Section 184 American Indian Home Loan Program and the ways that we can see and examine suburbanization in American Indian people today through particular socioeconomic markers, including education, employment, and home ownership across urban, suburban, and rural residential locations. So there are several major interventions that American Indians and the American Dream contributes to. In particular, creating a space for suburban Indians is a scholarly area of study. So this research firmly situates suburban Indians as a distinct category of American Indian people who are unique from reservation-based American Indian people and also separate from larger areas of urban Indians and highly urban areas like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, Denver, the Bay Area, etc. Thinking about suburban Indians as a distinct category provides a more accurate lens from which to think about American Indian people, especially contemporarily, as we know that today more and more American Indian people are living off reservation and moving to metropolitan areas, and increasingly they're moving into suburbs. Throughout the book, not only do I work to situate American Indian people in suburbs, but I also work to argue and demonstrate that they were active participants in processes or waves of suburbanization, particularly during the 20th century. From the 1930s on, American Indian people sought out ways to access suburban living and increasingly home ownership as well. This remains true today as an increasingly visible and sizable American Indian middle class has taken shape. And a lot of this is also due to the ways that they have unique ways they have found to access home ownership. A sub-theme throughout the book calls attention to the ways we think about suburbs today and challenges the widely held assumption that suburbs are predominantly white places. Instead, I argue that suburbs, again, are historically indigenous places to not only highlight the ways dispossession was and continues to operate, but to remind readers that American Indian people have always lived in these spaces. American Indians and the American Dream also does important work peeling back the historical layers to reveal the ways American Indian people specifically were impacted and excluded by federal housing policies. So there has long been scholarly attention given to the ways that African Americans experience exclusionary housing policies, and rightly so. And recently, scholars of ethnic studies have looked at how Asian Americans and Latinx communities have experienced racism in the housing market in suburbs in particular, but no other book-length project centers American Indian people in an examination of federal housing policy. Finally, American Indians in the American Dream is important because these stories and the reality that it shares are applicable to so many American Indian people from coast to coast. As I've already mentioned, today nearly 70% of American Indian people live off reservation, and increasingly they're living in suburban areas. So this isn't just a story of my experience and my family. This is a story that rings true for thousands of American Indian people. So on that note, I want to share 2 bar graphs that come from the book to help think through where American Indian people have lived since the start of the 21st century. So beginning in 2000, respondents to the United States Census could, for the first time, identify as one or more race groups. And there's a scholar at the University of Minnesota named Carolyn Liebler. She's a sociologist, and her work really examines American Indians on the census, how they identify, where they live. And her work has drawn attention to the way American Indian people identify in terms of, do they identify on the census as one racial category, that being American Indian, and then identify in a specific tribe? Or are they identifying as American Indian and white, or and black? And her work points that those who identify as single race American Indian, which is the bottom bar graph here, those who identify as single race American Indian are more likely to live in a rural area. So this is the bar that's white in color. So year 2000 and year 2010. So single race American Indians are more likely to live in a rural or reservation area. Those who identify as single race and live in suburbs are represented in the gray shaded box. And those who identify as single race American Indians and live in urban areas suburban areas is the black box, urban areas is the gray box, and the white box again is rural or reservation areas. So in contrast, American Indians who identify as American Indian plus one or more other race groups are more likely to live in suburbs. So this is the top bar graph. American Indians who live in suburbs and identify as multi-race are represented by the black bars. So living in suburbs. So these numbers have really helped me think through contemporarily, but then to reflect on how we got here, how we got to these numbers. Today, we must take a historical look to understand both federal Indian policy and federal housing policy. And that is why I begin my work in this book in the mid-19th century. So shifting gears a bit, the next 5 slides provide historical context to think through the book in American Indians and Suburbs, past and present. So on the screen are 2 images. On the right is a map created by Alan Ominsky in 1999, and it was reproduced in the book, Making Minnesota to Territory. It's easily found on the Minnesota Historical Society website. So this image on the left shows the different treaties that have occurred across present-day Minnesota that were an effort to break up tribal land holdings and to force Ojibwe, Dakota, and also Ho-Chunk communities onto reservations across present-day Minnesota. So those of you who I assume are pretty familiar with this history, we know that Ojibwe communities were largely across the northern half of present-day Minnesota, with Dakota communities in the southern half of the state of Minnesota. Being in Wisconsin now, I'm increasingly familiar with Ho-Chunk history, which I don't think we get as much of here in Minnesota. So there were several Ho-Chunk reservations throughout present-day Minnesota, here in central Minnesota and south central Minnesota, and then in far southeastern Minnesota as well. The Ho-Chunk, along with the Dakota, were forcibly exiled in the wake of the US-Dakota War. But these images are nice. This image is nice because we can see the different treaties that affected different parcels of land beginning in 1805, 1803 with the creation, with the parcel of land that Fort Snelling sits on today, being the first treaty in the state of present-day Minnesota. So understanding this history of land loss, dispossession through treaties is really important in how suburbs took shape. So is understanding Dakota exile and diaspora following the US-Dakota War. So the image on the right is Dakota diaspora, created by Bob Warner, also pulled from the Minnesota Historical Society website. And this image shows the extent of Dakota movement out of the state of Minnesota in the violent aftermath of the US-Dakota War. So the book opens in this time frame, the mid-19th century, when the federal government was actively pursuing Indian land via treaties to then open that land for non-native settlement. Between 1850 and 1910, there was exponential growth in the non-native population of the state. In 1850, the non-native population of the territory was just over 6,000 persons. By 1910, the non-native population had exploded to over 2 million people. This rapid influx of non-native settlers absolutely contributed to the US-Dakota War and the exile, and continues to contribute to the lack of access to Dakota homelands today for Dakota people. So the mid-19th century Minnesota was a time of dramatic change and really shaped the coming decades and the coming centuries of what the land would look like and who had access to land. So on this slide, I really want to highlight the exclusionary policies that were at play. So I look at a lot of the exclusionary policies in chapter 2 and in chapter 3 of the book. So American Indians and the American Dream looks at mid-1930s housing policy in chapter 2. So within weeks of one another in 1934, the federal government passed legislation creating the Federal Housing Administration at the same time that the Bureau of Indian Affairs put a halt to the allotment policy through the Indian Reorganization Act, also known as the IRA. One of the legacies of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which is regularly reflected on today, is the history of discriminatory lending practices, namely the practices of redlining that worked in tandem with race-based covenants to exclude persons other than those belonging to the Caucasian race from specific residential properties. So on this slide, on the far left is a redlining map of Minneapolis that comes from the 1930s. So if we look at this image on the left, we can see the Mississippi River running through the city. We can see the chain of lakes on the far left side. And we see different colored areas. So in looking at this map, there are a few pockets of green. So down here by the lakes. And there's a small pocket right up here as well that's harder to see. So these green neighborhoods are described on the map as being the best neighborhoods. They are given the letter grade A. We also see larger areas in blue on this map, down in the southern part, South Minneapolis, up in Northeast Minneapolis, and even in areas of North Minneapolis today. So these deep blue areas are given the letter grade B and are described as still desirable. Neighborhoods shaded in yellow on this map were described as definitely declining. And finally, we see neighborhoods in red, those particularly along the Mississippi River here. So the neighborhoods in red were given the letter grade F and were labeled as hazardous. So this is how redlining worked. It assigned letter grades and colors. Green mean great, go for it, right? And red being no, stop, these are dangerous. And these corresponded to an assigned level of risk for investors, for banks, for lenders. Here, neighborhoods in red, hence redlining, received the letter grade D or F, and investors and banks were discouraged from lending to persons who sought to buy a home in these areas. So at the same time this was happening, race-based covenants were already in operation. And we see race-based covenants in this image on the far right. So this is a contemporary image pulled from the Just Deeds website. Just Deeds is a really great resource that is working with communities across the Twin Cities to acknowledge and reconcile this history of race-based covenants. So this is a contemporary map of Edina, one of the well-known examples of race-based covenants at the national level, and obviously here in Minnesota. So Edina, again, is a regularly cited example of how race-based covenants were used. And looking at this map, the areas shaded in red are properties whose deeds included a race-based covenant intended to keep people from the non-white race from accessing or buying property. In the upper right-hand corner, we can see a high concentration of properties with race-based covenants. This is the present-day community of the country club area of Edina. So we know that race-based covenants were commonplace in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and the 1950s. In 1948, a Supreme Court case, Shelley v. Kramer, struck down race-based covenants as unenforceable, but they continued to go on unchallenged. And for most properties and places, nobody did the active work of removing the race-based covenants from those property deeds. So this is the work of Just Deeds today, is to encourage present-day homeowners to look at the historical records for their homes to see if it had a race-based covenant and to do the work of removing it. Finally, on the center of this slide, we have a promotional image from the post-World War II era that promoted the GI Bill. So I consider the GI Bill as an exclusionary housing policy as well, the home loan benefit of the GI Bill. The GI Bill's home loan program significantly contributed to the widespread expansion of suburbia after World War II. However, a closer look reveals the ways it was exclusionary to those who were not white, to those veterans who were not white, in this case, American Indian veterans. While American Indian veterans who served during World War II were entitled to the benefits of the GI Bill, including the home loan programs, they were actively redirected towards the Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program and discouraged from receiving a home loan through the GI Bill. So these are examples of the exclusionary housing policies that span the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, and into the 1960s as well. So this next slide brings us to World War II, and the post-World War II era. So as World War II was ending and the GI Bill was unfolding, a totally different policy for American Indian people was taking shape through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The Job Training and Relocation Program was in de facto operation as World War II was ending, but it did not become official policy until the legislation was passed in 1956. The Relocation and Job Training Program was designed as a cost-saving mechanism. So again, this is going on at the same time as the GI Bill, which was extremely expensive, and then the relocation program was seen as a way to save the federal government millions of dollars in both the short term but also the long term. So the relocation program was part of the larger termination era. So if we think about termination as an umbrella, the relocation and job training program falls under that. The termination era was a way for the federal government to terminate their responsibility and obligations to American Indian people. Again, a cost-saving mechanism. The federal government looked to the degree of assimilation of tribal nations to determine what tribal nations would be slated for termination. And in total, during the termination era, which lasted in the 1950s into the early 1960s, 109 tribal nations across the United States were terminated. Numerous tribes in the state of California were terminated, and most close to here in Minnesota, the Menominee and Wisconsin were terminated. Most of the tribes terminated during this policy have been able to reacquire their federally recognized status, but there are a handful of tribes that were terminated during this era that have not been able to regain federal recognition. So termination was the government saying, you are assimilated, and we are going to fail to recognize any of our treaty obligations to you and no longer provide any sort of services, healthcare, education specifically, but also tribes who were terminated lost their land status. If they had land held in trust, the land was taken out of trust. So for the Menominee in Wisconsin, they lost their reservation, and again, we saw another wave of non-native settlers quickly buy up that land. So relocation is part of this era. So termination, tribes that were terminated were looked at their degree of assimilation for their individual tribal members, and relocation worked similarly. So relocation was a way for the federal government to move American Indian people away from reservations, areas that they were once forced onto, and to say, okay, I want you to fully assimilate, so now I'm going to move you off the reservation to a designated urban area. So across the country, there were about 10, 15 relocation destinations, depending on the time period. Relocation areas kind of expanded as the program unfolded. Minneapolis was not a designated relocation area, but it became a de facto relocation destination, particularly for Ojibwe people in areas of Minnesota and Wisconsin. So there were large numbers of Native people coming to Minneapolis during the relocation years. Other relocation destinations included Chicago, Oklahoma City, Denver, Juneau, Alaska, San Jose, California, Los Angeles, California. So these were areas where Native people were moved to. So I look at the relocation, again, at the same time as the GI Bill. So the GI Bill is providing predominantly white veterans access to home ownership, and predominantly in suburbs, so new construction homes in suburban areas. At the same time that relocation is moving American Indian people off of reservations into designated urban areas. And the way that relocation worked is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would provide these relocatees, often individuals, but sometimes entire families, a one-way bus ticket or a one-way rail ticket, and a short-term stipend to get them on their feet. And when I say short term, I mean 2 weeks. Individuals and families could request additional support, and sometimes they'd be given an additional 2 weeks or a month. But this was by no means long-term support. There are really great relocation records at the Newberry Library in Chicago and also at the Federal Archives in Kansas City, where relocation records from Minnesota are kept. And there are instances of relocated Indian people moving to short-term housing units in both Chicago and Minneapolis. And the accommodations they received was a 2-week stay at a local YMCA. There's records out of Minneapolis where Native people were moved into really, really awful conditions, where individuals reported overcrowding, lack of fully functioning electricity, plumbing facilities, housing units that were slated to be condemned. So this is also the era where we see like white flight starting to occur, where we know increasing numbers of, again, white people are moving out of the city, increasing numbers of people of color, African Americans, American Indians are moving into the city. So there's a lot going on. So Minneapolis was not an official relocation destination, but we know Native people were moving here in high numbers from areas of northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. So they did open up a relocation office here in Minneapolis. So relocation took shape during World War II. It was in de facto in operation as soon as World War II ended, but it didn't become the official policy until 1956, and it lasted into the 1960s. There are really great records that describe American Indian people who went on relocation, a lot of whom were veterans, and a lot of these individuals specifically reached out to a relocation officer or the VA to inquire about home ownership opportunities, and many times they were told, no, you must work with the BIA because you're Indian, which is not correct. Because they were Native, they actually were if they were a veteran, they were entitled to both programs. So there was a lot of confusion at different levels of bureaucracy, but also a lot of red tape. So I think in looking at these records, these archival records, we can really see how the federal government worked to direct Native people towards Bureau of Indian Affairs relocation program. Again, short-term rental housing in the city versus the VA's GI Bill and home loan benefit. So these are legacies that we continue to contend with today when we think about who has access to home ownership in suburbs, particularly when we think about the generational wealth that is associated with home ownership. And if we know Native people had been excluded for so long, they are only able to get their foot in the door in recent years. So today we know that the relocation program was largely a failure. This was due to high levels of return rates. So again, Native people are given the one-way bus ticket, a one-way rail ticket, a few weeks accommodation in the cities. Many of them were unprepared for what city living would look like. When they arrived, they obviously didn't have very good housing conditions. Many also were not able to find employment or sustainable employment that allowed them to provide for themselves and also their families. So return rates for American Indian people who went on relocation to go back to the reservation, numbers are at the 60 to 75% rate. So again, this was seen as a cost-saving mechanism that really would push American Indian people to fully assimilate. In fact, my argument is that if the federal government really wanted American Indian people to assimilate and leave reservations, this program should have more closely followed the Veteran Affairs home loan program to provide them with avenues to stay in the cities longer, a more long-term basis through home ownership. So the relocation program eventually ended in the 1960s. And what grew out of the relocation was high concentrations of American Indian people in specific urban communities across the country. So these urban areas became a sort of mecca for American Indian people who came together and created intertribal organizations to provide services for community members who arrived to the cities. And Minneapolis is just one example of this. So these are some images that were used to promote the relocation program. So one of the images here on the upper right-hand corner, I can see, it's pretty small for all of you. But what we see in this upper right-hand image are two women pushing young children in strollers. So they're dressed pretty nice, walking in a nice area, and this comes from the Newberry Library in Chicago. So this is, a way to show that, hey, come on relocation. You can be like these women with your babies, wearing nice clothes and living in a nice suburban area, when we know that that is not what they actually received. The image below that on the right-hand side says, come to Denver, the chance of your lifetime. Good jobs, happy homes, training, and beautiful Colorado. So again, images that were used to promote this idea of moving away from reservations and coming to an urban area to make that look really desirable. The image on the bottom left-hand corner is a group of young women who are arriving to Los Angeles on relocation. And the image on the top left is a young Native woman and her two children at the Intertribal Friendship House, one of the organizations that grew out of relocation to serve American Indian community members. So that leads me to my next slide, which specifically looks at the urban Indian community in Minneapolis that grew out of relocation. So this slide highlights what Indian Minneapolis has looked like over the last 75 years. Services and organizations that took shape in Minneapolis for American Indian community members include survival schools like Heart of the Earth in Minneapolis and the Red Schoolhouse in St. Paul. So the image on the top left is Heart of the Earth in Minneapolis. It no longer exists, but this school was in operation. It was located near the University of Minnesota. And it took shape to fulfill the educational needs of Native youth living in Minneapolis in particular. Similarly, the Indian Health Board in Minneapolis, the large image in the center, which continues to administer Indian health services to American Indian people, not only in Minneapolis, but the larger metro area. AIM, the American Indian movement in the upper right, took shape in the post-relocation years in Minneapolis. The American Indian movement was created here in Minneapolis, or I should say next door in Minneapolis. And it grew out of this political era, not only of relocation, but also post-civil rights era at the national level. We can see many similarities between the American Indian movement and also the Black Panthers political organization. On the bottom right, we see an image of the Minneapolis American Indian Center, which is currently going a really exciting major renovation to better serve the American Indian community member in the community in the Twin Cities. And then on the far left, on the bottom, we see Little Earth, which also grew out of this kind of era of urban relocation, post-World War II, a growing American Indian community in the Twin Cities with housing needs. And Little Earth, of course, continues to serve American Indian community members and is the only federally funded American Indian preference low-income housing community in the country. So I have just a few more slides here. Jumping to the 2000s and the 21st century, I want to briefly speak on the Section 184 home loan program, which I find that many people have never heard of, which is unfortunate because it is a really important program. The Section 184 home loan program is the first and only American Indian home ownership program. It began in 1992 as a way to attempt to address American Indian housing needs, but it was only to be used on reservation. So in order to be eligible for the Section 184 home loan program, you must be an enrolled tribal citizen of a federally recognized tribe. So beginning in 1992, this program was created for those people who lived on reservation to access home ownership. In 2004, it was expanded to be used off reservation as well. So what we see on this map here is contemporary United States shaded in yellow, red, or white. So the Section 184 program is administered by HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and it provides those folks who are eligible for it, again, tribally enrolled citizens of federally recognized tribes who live in a designated Indian area. It provides them with low down payment, lower than normal down payments, a lower interest rate that isn't necessarily tied to your credit score. The credit score for applicants is still required, but it doesn't make your interest rate skyrocket if you have a less than stellar credit score. Individuals who qualify for the Section 184 loan program also are not required to pay private monthly mortgage insurance. And then they also have access to folks at HUD to help administer their loan in the underwriting process. So in looking at this map, we see areas of the country shaded in yellow, a good portion of the upper Great Plains, the West Coast, and the central United States. These states shaded in yellow, individuals who qualify for the Section 184 loan program can use the loan anywhere in these states, whether they live on reservation, off reservation, in a major urban area, or in a suburb. You can use the loan anywhere in these areas, regardless of what your tribal affiliation is as well, which is really important. We see a few states highlighted in red, right through the center of the United States, and a few of the western states as well, and some of the states in the Northeast. So states that are highlighted in red, individuals who qualify for the Section 184 home loan program can use the loan to access homes and select counties. So for some of these states, it might be like 1 or 2 counties. In some of the states, like New York, this is one of my favorite examples, folks can use the Section 184 home loan program in New York in every county except for the 5 counties that immediately surround New York City. So it is my opinion that the reason you can't use it in those 5 major counties is because that is where the real estate property prices are the highest. There's also rules with the Section 184 loan program, like you can't build a house. I'm just going to make up you can't build a house in like Anoka that's like $8 million, right? It has to like be in line with the market value of the homes in the area. But we know that real estate prices around New York City are extremely expensive. So there's, again, certain counties in these red states where you can and cannot use the loan. And then we have some states shaded in shaded in white. And the states that are shaded in white, you cannot use the Section 184 loan program anywhere in that state. So this map is from 2019. The state of Tennessee is now a red state. You can use it in some counties in Tennessee, and that's a more recent update. So we see the color coding on this map, but we also see some numbers, and these numbers represent the Section 184 programs to date as of 2019, which is the most recent version of this map. Based on my searches, the HUD is no longer providing a map like that has the numbers post-2019. I'm not sure why. I'm sure the numbers are available, they're just not so publicly available. So what's interesting to me is to look at Minnesota and Wisconsin, states that are very similar, share similar populations. And in Minnesota, as of 2019, only 558 Section 184 loans had been granted. 558. Wisconsin has granted, or I shouldn't say Wisconsin grants because the state doesn't grant these, but 1,692 Section 184 loans have been secured in the state of Wisconsin during the same time period. So quite a few more for states that are very similar. So it's interesting to look at these numbers how many folks are using the Section 184 loan program by geography. So finally, on this slide here, I have 3 bar graphs that represent home ownership in Minnesota, American Indian home ownership in Minnesota. The graph on the far left is overall American Indian home ownership. So far left, overall American Indian home ownership. The black represents home ownership for American Indians who live in urban areas in 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. In the middle, the gray shaded column are suburban Indians, and the white is rural or reservation-based Indians. So again, this is overall home ownership. What I think is really interesting is to look at home ownership rates based on mortgage. So American Indians who have a home via mortgage that they are currently paying on, and then the image on the far right, which is American Indian outright home ownership. So they own the house in full. So American Indians who are homeowners via mortgage are more likely to live in suburbs, and American Indians who are outright homeowners are more likely to live in a rural or reservation area. So a lot of this has to do with land on reservation, which is held in trust and therefore cannot be bought and sold. So when individuals are buying homes on reservations, it generally is the physical structure itself, so not necessarily as expensive. But we also know that a lot of the homes on reservation are older, oftentimes constructed in the 1960s, and they pass down through families. So just because there are higher rates of home ownership on reservation, it doesn't mean that that home ownership looks the same as it does off reservation. The US Census does an American Community Survey that's continuously cycled that gathers really rich information about what homeownership looks like for people. So it asks questions about how many people live in dwellings. We can learn more about per capita income, the number of rooms available, the plumbing, the electricity, the number of cars, access to internet, which I think is a really rich source of data for looking at what home ownership looks like based on residential location, which I kind of dig into in the 5th chapter of the book as well. So, American Indians and the American Dream, some closing thoughts. So for me, I want to encourage readers and all of you here today to think about how housing should be a treaty obligation, something that is a responsibility of the federal government that is specifically outlined in treaties. Like, I'm not just making this up. It's not just my, hey, it's a treaty obligation. But if you actually look at the text of many treaties, there are stipulations that the federal government would provide certain kinds of housing for American Indian people, very similar to how healthcare and education is also outlined in those same treaties. Today, particularly here in Minnesota, we see some really exciting efforts going on around the land back movement. We see land back movements occurring by the federal government returning land, state government returning land, and also individual property owners returning land to Native peoples. So I want to think and encourage you all to think about how the land back movement can also help facilitate access to homelands and potentially also housing for Native people. And again, to encourage folks to think about suburbs as Indigenous spaces, past and present. So one of the maps in my book is this image up here in the upper right-hand corner. And again, I know it's hard to see, but if you see this list of places below it, we know that all of the Twin Cities today are Indigenous places. Again, just recognizing the homeland or the names of places. But this map outlines the different Dakota villages, the sacred places, and the lakes and rivers across the Twin Cities with their Dakota name and also an English translation. So that is all. I want to thank you for your time and also welcome questions.
Well, as usual, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll run a mic to you so we can hear it all. So,
I have a question about the generational wealth. When you show the higher percentage of home ownership in the rural areas, has that contributed to generational wealth for those people, or is the home ownership in the Native community not contributing to generational wealth as it does in the white community?
That's a really great question. So when I think about this question, I think about Native people who are homeowners on reservation who own a home on trust land. So that home is not bought and sold the same way off-reservation housing is. So that form of home ownership would not contribute to generational wealth the same way that home ownership off-reservation would be, because when you live on reservation on trust land, not anybody can just move there and buy that house, right? The banks don't insure those houses for just everybody, but we also know that allotment played a really significant role across the entire United States in who can live on reservation. So there are reservations today in Minnesota where there are more non-Native residents than Native community members. So you really have to look at the individual parcel of land to understand if that land is held in trust or not. And if it is not held in trust, then anybody could buy that land, which drives the value of it up, I would say. But in thinking about generational wealth, we know that housing and property, land, is like the biggest way wealth is held in the United States. So we know that American Indians and also other people of color, African Americans in particular, have not had the same access to housing and land until much more recently. And I think all of us would agree that we know that racism still exists in the housing market today. So it's more limited in the way that the generational wealth for people of color, including American Indians, is much more limited, and even more limited for on-reservation home ownership.
Talk a bit about the location of the nuclear power plant at Red Wing.
Yeah, so that is something I'm less familiar with, and I don't look at it in my research. But what I do know is that there's this whole concept of environmental racism, where we see things like nuclear power plants being located in close proximity to communities of color and American Indian reservations in particular. I sometimes teach on this in the classes that I teach at Wisconsin, and you can Google environmental racism and see the location of nuclear power plants across the country and their proximity to tribal reservations, which we also then know drives down property values. So we see environmental racism not just with nuclear power plants, but with like waste storage, like disposal facilities, where it's kind of that concept of like not in my backyard, right? These things that we know we need, but nobody wants it near them because of not only health effects, but also property values. And I would say that is a significant problem for American Indian communities, where things that people don't want, but we sometimes think we need, are located near reservations that they were also forced onto, right?
Yeah, so our question here, the HUD 184 loan program, is that a program which real estate agents or bank loan agents inform the potential buyer or the existence, or does the buyer need to pursue the loan independently?
That's a really great question. And I would say not very many folks know about it because it isn't, like, I would say, public knowledge, but it is the individual's responsibility to pursue it. So it is a HUD-administered program, but not all banks or lenders are authorized to carry it out. So you can go on the HUD website, and there are particular lenders by state who are authorized to fulfill the Section 184 loan program. I would say most realtors, real estate agents do not know about it. You can't just like walk into US Bank and say, hey, I want this. It has to be a HUD authorized lender who can administer the loan, which requires them to have like additional training. So there are lenders sometimes who are authorized to provide the loan in, say, the state of Wisconsin or the state of Minnesota. There are some lenders who can provide across like 8 states. So it's really place specific and lender specific, but it's not something all lenders can do. So it's like a great program, but it's also another level of like red tape and bureaucracy because it's administered through HUD. You have to work with a lender. You kind of have to get like approval at multiple stages for everything to fall into place and to go through. So it's the individual's responsibility. It's a great program. You just have to be able to navigate it, and it just adds an extra layers to the already complicated home buying process.
Oh, Kasey, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about the project with Crystal with visibility for the suburban families in northwestern Twin Cities with Wakpanan and Bassett Creek, and like the process of oral histories and how to generate visibility for suburban American Indians.
Yeah, so great question. So recently, over the last few years, I have partnered with Valley Community Presbyterian Church in Golden Valley. We have 2 representatives from Valley Community Presbyterian Church today in the center of our audience. Crystal Boyd was a project manager on a project that I worked with called the Wakpanan Bassett Creek Oral History Project. And what we did was we did some grant funding to collect oral histories from American Indian people who lived in the West Metro, in the Bassett Creek area in particular, and in Golden Valley. We collected 16 oral histories from American Indian people today who have experienced the suburbs. Many of these stories really came out of the relocation era, post-World War II era, Indian urbanization era of the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. We had a few narrators, participants, who shared their experiences accessing suburbs for the first time in the 1950s, 1960s, and coming out of Minneapolis, so we can really see how these policies were at play. There were a few narrators who were a bit younger, who spent their entire lives living in the suburbs and really reflected on it for the first time during this interview process. But these oral histories are available online. So I think this is part of this is something that so many Native people experience, this suburbanization process. So they're a great resource for folks who are interested. One of the more notable folks who contributed to the oral history collection is Diane Wilson, who's an author here in the Twin Cities. She wrote Spirit Car and the Seed Keeper, and she lived in suburban Golden Valley as well. So it was a really great project for folks who are interested in wanting to learn more about American Indian individuals' relationship with suburbs. A lot of the narrators also spoke to the work of education and their experience of suburb and participating in American Indian education programming as well. It was a great project. I encourage folks to seek out the oral history collection available online.
Other questions? We got here.
How do you account for the difference in the number of mortgages between Wisconsin and Minnesota?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I've been in Wisconsin now for 5 years, and when I lived in Minnesota, I never really thought too much about Wisconsin. I was just like, oh, they're so similar. But now being in Wisconsin, I'm learning so much more Ho-Chunk history, and I think part of it is the way that Ho-Chunk people access land in the 19th century as well. So the Ho-Chunk there were many waves of forced removal of Ho-Chunk people out of Wisconsin. That's why they were in Minnesota for a while. There's Ho-Chunk communities today in Nebraska as well. But Ho-Chunk people really took advantage of the Homestead Act in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s to also secure land. So in Wisconsin, there's a number of Ojibwe reservations in the northern part of the state. There's Potawatomi, Menominee, Oneida, et cetera. But the Ho-Chunk, who are predominantly in southern Wisconsin, south central, southwest Wisconsin, don't have a contiguous land base. They don't have a contiguous reservation. Instead, they have they're called homestead parcels. And it's because community members used the Homestead Act to buy land outright. So a colleague of mine at Wisconsin named Steve Kantrowitz, he recently wrote a book about the Ho-Chunk that examined kind of this legacy and how the Ho-Chunk people used the Homestead Act to secure land, and then also pursued home ownership using the Section 184 home loan program. So they almost kind of like had like a head start because they were forced to find creative ways to access housing. So I think that's part of it. There's also a bank in Wisconsin called Bay Bank, which is like one of these lenders that administers the Section 184 home loan program. So there are more, I would say, tribally authorized lenders in Wisconsin to administer Section 184 than here in Wisconsin. So Bay Bank works with a lot of Oneida, a lot of Menominee. So the question from Zoom was, whose responsibility or role is it to pursue and find out about the Section 184 home loan program? It is the individual's responsibility, but a lender like Bay Bank, which is a native lender, does a lot of community outreach as well. So I think those two factors really contribute to having higher rates of usage of the Section 184 home loan program.
I want to go back to the termination. When you look at 184, are the people who are members of the terminated tribal nations eligible for that, or are they considered so fully assimilated that they don't have any recognition or entry point for these options?
So during termination, 109 tribes were terminated, and you can easily find this list online. Most tribes were able to regain their federally recognized status. So there are a handful of tribes that are still terminated, and they are not eligible for the Section 184 loan program because, unfortunately, the federal government does not recognize them, right? But if we look at this map, and we look at the states that are white, where you're not eligible, that are ineligible for the Section 184 loan program, these states are also I keep holding this by my mouth like it's a microphone. It's not. Sorry. These are states where there are not large American Indian populations, and we don't see reservation communities like we do in the central United States and western United States. So colonization largely happened from east to west. There's huge caveats to this with California and the Spanish in the Southwest in particular, but because of the way colonization happened largely from east to west, a lot of Native people from the states on the East Coast and these white shaded areas were removed and moved west. So that, I think, better accounts for why we don't see the usage or eligibility of the Section 184 loan program in these areas. But for tribes that were terminated and they regained their federally recognized status, they can use the Section 184 loan program.
Well, this is again concerning the 184, because you talked about the discrepancy between Wisconsin and Minnesota, but I'm looking at the discrepancy between Nebraska and Oklahoma. Oklahoma has what, 45% of the loans?
Yeah. So Oklahoma, for folks that can't see, there have been over 20,000 Section 184 loan program loans in the state of Wisconsin, in the state of Oklahoma as of 2019. And I would say one of the reasons for that is because of the large number of American Indian people who live in Oklahoma. They have a much higher rate of American Indian people just in the state in general in terms of population. There's more lenders who are authorized to carry out the Section 184 loan program in Oklahoma as well. I'm not overly familiar with what that looks like, but I would assume it would be similar to Wisconsin, where those lenders are able to do more outreach, and they probably do more outreach because they have a larger population, right? More folks who are wanting to use it. Oklahoma, of course, is like Indian territory, so it has a really different historical legacy than all the other states in terms of Native people living there as well. But yeah, that is an astounding number, right? 20,000.
Then I have one other question, and this is Section 184. You said that there's, that extra bureaucracy to get that. You were talking about the after World War II with the GI Bill and the relocation, and where you made it almost sound benign that people were pushing the American Indians to the relocation rather than the GI Bill. Was it that benign, or was it just we're not going to let you have it?
Yeah, I think both. So in the historical records that I looked at, I have found records of Native veterans specifically reaching out to the BIA and specifically reaching out to the VA to try to access the GI Bill benefit, and they were continuously redirected. And I think sometimes it was very intentional, and I'm sure racism played a role in that, right? Because I guess I don't know why else somebody would do that. But I also think that folks who worked for the BIA, folks who worked for VA, some of them were just largely uninformed. And I have found evidence where people were like, well, you're Native, you need to work with the BIA. And it was benign, because I don't think they realized that, yes, they also were eligible for the GI Bill. So I have found instances of both. So I think the individual experience tells us, was this a matter of just ignorance and these people working for the federal government simply did not know? Or was it intentional, in an intentional redirection?
Michael, another one from Zoom.
Yeah, I'm going to combine two questions here that have a similar theme. First, your final graphs seem to show declining home ownership for American Indians. Do you have any comments on that? But also, how does Indigenous thoughts on land ownership impact ownership?
Yeah. So this is something that I'm still grappling with, this last part of the question. How do American Indian notions of, thoughts of home ownership, property ownership, how is that reflected, right? So this is a non-native model. Property ownership is how we think of it today is really a non-native model that was brought here through colonization. So that's something I still think through a lot of what does it mean to be a Native person and own property? What does it mean for me to be a Native woman owning property in Madison, Wisconsin, where I know Ho-Chunk people were forcibly removed from? So I think this is a very individual and something that a lot of Native people grapple with, is what does it mean to be a property owner, particularly in places where Native communities have been removed from and may not be able to access today. So I can't answer that one, but it is something that I think a lot about, and I'm sure other Native property owners think about it similarly. The first part of that question was thinking about home ownership and how can we reconcile home ownership and Indigenous property ownership through something like home ownership, I think is how I'm understanding it. I also like to think about private property, again, as something that came with colonization, but also something that was forced on Native people. So we see like policies of allotment and Section 184 and this designation of Indian area to be eligible for the loan. And I think it's, putting like a Western concept of individual property ownership onto like Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And can you ever clearly reconcile those? And the answer is no. So Native people today in many ways are forced to work within the confines of individual property ownership. And we see things like the land back movement, acquiring land. We see tribal nations working to put land into trust, because we know that that is one way to protect land, is through property ownership or putting land into trust. So I think it's, comparing apples to oranges, and that these are totally different concepts. American Indian ways of maintaining the land, caring for the land, relationships with the land, and non-native property ownership. But what
So-
do we do?
So do you think that this, as there's more thought on these concepts of, the differences between the ownerships or the differences between the Western ownership and Indigenous, do you think that is contributing to a decline in home ownership in more modern times?
Oh, in more modern times, a decline in homeownership in more modern times. Oh, I'm going to say no. I think we see a decline in homeownership in more modern times because of property values and how expensive things are getting. These graphs, when we jump from 2000 to 2010, that was post-Great Recession. So I think today we would see even greater decline in access to property and housing because of how expensive it has been. I think just recently there have been articles published on how hard it is to buy homes for people of color, American Indians in particular, because they are continuously priced out, right? It is really hard to get a home right now if you don't have a home to sell because of just how expensive it is and putting a down payment in. So if you don't have that generational wealth, if you aren't selling a home to buy a home, it's really hard to get a foothold.
I know there are more questions, so I invite you to ask them to Dr. Keeler yourself. Afterwards, she'll be signing books upstairs. But please join me in giving a round of applause and a thank you for her sharing her work. Thanks also for coming. One thing she mentioned about the Ho-Chunk being indigenous to University of Wisconsin-Madison, I know they put up a recent land acknowledgement plaque that's titled Our Shared Future. We at the Historical Society, we work to talk about the history of all Minnesotans and our shared history, as complicated and messy and difficult as that can be. But the reason we do that is so we can build a shared future together. And I think this is a great example of this is important history so that we can then think about how do we partner together, native, non-native, whoever you may be, to build a better shared future for all. So take that with you. Enjoy your day.